It's the 3rd of December 1854. Up in Government Camp, Ballarat, the outpost of colonial authority on this goldfield, Captain John Wesley Thomas is busy writing a report of the action which took place just a few hours ago. Unlike a lot of reports which will be released in the coming days, this one is short and completely devoid of flowery language or the techniques which English teachers in the future will one day call persuasive devices. This is partly because, as a career soldier, Thomas doesn't have any patience for long-winded reports and just wants to get the job done, but also because he's got rather a lot on his plate right now. He's got men in the hospital, including 2 of his officers, and 3 of his soldiers are lying dead on a cart outside. Thankfully, someone's covered up the dead men, but they need to be buried as quickly as possible, and without agitating the shocked population of Ballarat or denuding Government Camp of its troops. The soldiers who survived this morning's attack on the entrenchment on the Eureka gold lead are caught between conflicting emotions. They're delighted to have succeeded, but they're also furious about the deaths of their friends and especially the wounding of their officers. Some of them have already tried to kill the prisoners they hold responsible, and the need to maintain cohesion and discipline among his men is critical. Thomas is not a man who's got any patience with revenge, which is probably fortunate for the stockaders now imprisoned. Speaking of prisoners, he's got 114 of them he needs to keep safe and contained until their hearings begin the next day, and some of them need medical attention. The surgeon's busy with Thomas's own men right now, but he'll see the prisoners when he can. And then there's also the matter of the population of Ballarat, some of whom are grieving or have lost their homes and worldly possessions in the wake of the fight. And, to make matters worse, there's a rumour that there are still 200 heavily armed Americans lurking somewhere in the bush who could relaunch an attack at any time. That's not to mention the survivors of the stockade itself who managed to avoid arrest, whom Thomas fears could regroup and storm Government Camp, just as they'd been threatening to do for the past week. The reinforcements he called from Melbourne won't arrive for another 2 days, and neither Thomas nor Ballarat will breathe easy until then. Under the circumstances, it's incredible he's managed to find time to write a report at all. He's also conscious of the governor breathing down his neck, and if there's one thing Thomas has far too much experience with, it's interfering politicians. That said, he has a lot of respect for Sir Charles Hotham and knows the governor holds him in high esteem. But that won't affect how he writes his report. Or will it? I'm Juliana, and you're listening to The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis. Hello, my fellow skeptics, and thank you as always for tuning in. Yet again today, I am podcasting on the lands of the Wurundjeri Wathaurong people, who have been part of this land for more than 65,000 years, and their connection to country remains unbroken to this day. Now, today's episode is linked to our recent examination of Peter Lawler's famous open letter, and is a chance for us to explore the other side of the Eureka story. This is the side that I'm actually looking closely at in my thesis, and it's one I think doesn't get enough attention. And that is the story of the soldiers of Eureka, rather than the stockaders. Now, the hero of our story, if you will, the main character today, is Captain John Wesley Thomas. Now, Thomas was Lawler's opposite number. He was the commander-in-chief of the military forces who attacked the Eureka stockade in the early morning hours of the 3rd of December 1854. If you need a refresher, by now you will know where to go. Like any good commander, Thomas wrote a report which was sent to the governor in Melbourne, and it was later published in the newspapers after it was sent to Parliament. It's nowhere near the length of Lawler's open letter. It comes in at 1,156 words before the casualty report, and this is compared to Lawler's rather lengthy missive of over 3,000 words. Now, the reason for this discrepancy is simple. Thomas was writing a report of an event, while Lawler, as we discovered last episode, was writing his election manifesto. Thomas didn't need to convince anyone of anything while Lawler needed to justify himself and prove he was right. Although, as we discovered last episode again, Lawler made Pinocchio look like a model of honesty. But does that mean that Thomas's report is automatically more factual, or that we shouldn't apply the same caution to reading his words as we did to those of Lawler? Of course not. Thomas didn't need to justify himself to the public or the governor, just to the Major General, who he had already informed. But that doesn't mean he didn't have an agenda, or that he told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help him God. He was certainly more honest than Lawler was, but he wrote for an audience who wanted specific details and who were keen to control the narrative, namely the governor and the Legislative Council. And he probably also knew there was a good chance his report would be published in the press and therefore read by the public. Ultimately, however, he wrote it for the politicians who had sent him to Ballarat and probably didn't give a lot of thought to public opinion in Melbourne. That's not to say it didn't affect him at all, but it would have been a secondary concern. After all, he had far greater problems to concern himself with in the aftermath of the stockade. Now, I'm going to go through the report at the end of this podcast, the way I did with Lawler's letter, so make sure you stick around after the credits if you want to hear it. Before we get into this document, though, who exactly was John Wesley Thomas? Well, fortunately, we know quite a bit about him. He's a fascinating character. So he was born in Somerset, England in 1822, and he was the third child and the second son of Frederick and Susanna Thomas, and her maiden name was Atherley. Now, Frederick Thomas was a rear admiral in the Navy and the second son of a baron, so minor aristocrat, and the Thomases were very well off, and John Wesley Thomas was schooled for a career in the Army, while his older brother Frederick Jr. was headed for the Navy. Now, Thomas's mother died when he was 6, and then when he was 12, his brother Frederick Jr. also died. Frederick was just 17. So this made Thomas the eldest son, but his father continued to encourage him towards a career in the Army rather than shifting him into the Navy. He would later graduate from Sandhurst at the top of his class, similar actually to Henry Wise, who he would later meet at Ballarat. And he was commissioned as an ensign, so this is a rank that no longer exists today, but roughly equivalent to a second lieutenant in the modern British Army. Now, what made Thomas very unique among his officer class peers was that he never purchased a commission right throughout his career, and he earned every promotion on merit, which is saying something for the time. He worked his way up from the ranks of ensign, and by the time he retired from active service in 1881, he was a major general. On retirement, he became an honorary lieutenant general, or lieutenant, I think they say in Britain, and he was later made a knight commander. He had a reputation as a very capable officer who had earned the respect of his men, and the Diary of a Soldier who served under him at Eureka remarked that Thomas was known to be fair and did not tend to have men flogged for small infractions. However, he didn't tolerate insubordination or poor behaviour from his troops and wasn't above using the lash. He also wasn't afraid to put himself in harm's way when the situation called for it. At Eureka, for example, when the heavy gunfire coming from the stockade caused the 40th Regiment to waver, Thomas dismounted and took an exposed position at the front of his troops and called something like, "40th, follow me!" and led his men in attacking the stockade. Had he been either killed or incapacitated, the whole attack would have collapsed. This wasn't the first time he'd put himself at risk either, nor would it be the last. Following his graduation from Sandhurst, Thomas joined the 40th immediately, and just months later went to the subcontinent. He was promoted to lieutenant and served in Afghanistan in 1842 during the disastrous British retreat. And on his return to India, he participated in the Battle of Marajapur, where he was badly wounded after exposing himself to rally his faltering troops, while his commanding officer stayed in a sheltered position at the rear. Now, the Battle of Marajapur actually had important consequences for Eureka, which I discussed in my episode, The 40th Regiment and the Crisis of 1851, if you want a refresher. In 1843, Thomas was promoted to captain and went back with the 40th to Ireland, and then on to Victoria in 1852. After Eureka, he was promoted to major and joined the 63rd Regiment, and he fought against the Chinese during the Boxer Rebellion and then later in the Taiping Rebellion. He received both promotions and commendations for these battles, but Taiping would be his last stint on active combat duty. He was wounded there while, once again, you guessed it, rallying his troops. He returned to England and continued to live as a single officer in the barracks until he retired in 1881. After his retirement, he moved to Kensington, close to where his cousin Godfrey Thomas, the Baron of Winove, lived, and he died at the age of 85 in 1908. Thomas was one of the longest-lived of any of the Eureka participants, ironically, and he outlived most of the stockaders, including Peter Lawler, and many of the soldiers that he himself had commanded there. He didn't marry and he never had any children, but he had a very close relationship with his cousin Godfrey, and this has led to speculation in some sources that Thomas may have been gay. Now, this is very difficult to give a definitive answer to, as many of the historical clues we look for that suggest a gay relationship during the Victorian era were only present in relationships between civilians or people living privately. For example, if someone was living with a quote-unquote friend of the same sex all their life, if they went everywhere together, if they were buried together, if they left possessions to each other, those sorts of things. As Thomas was a career soldier, a lot of these things didn't exist. Certainly, you could say he lived around men his whole life, but he lived in barracks until he retired and then alone in a small, albeit luxurious flat until his death. But there's no evidence that he was particularly close or closer than usual to any of his soldiers. And while the flat was close to his cousin's London home, they never lived together, and what's more, Baron Winove was married. Thomas was also buried alone, although Winove did inherit a third of Thomas's estate on his death, and the other 2/3 went to one of Thomas's younger brothers and a nephew, respectively. What we can say for certain on this question is that Thomas's upbringing left him very few opportunities to socialise with eligible young ladies, as he lived in all-male environments from a very young age. He attended an exclusive all-boys primary school from the time he was 6 or 7. He then boarded at Eton College before he went on to study at Sandhurst. After Sandhurst, he went straight into the army, where he remained for roughly 30 years. He may have been gay. It's certainly possible, or he may have simply decided to focus on his career rather than marriage. This was a time when neither sex could really have it all. You couldn't be a good husband and a good soldier. You had to put soldiering first. And what's more, even after the death of his older brother, Thomas was never going to inherit a large estate or title, so there wouldn't have been as much pressure on him to have heirs, especially since his younger brothers had already married and they already had more than one son each. So without some clue leading in one direction or another, it's impossible to say whether or not Thomas was a closet gay man or a career-driven soldier. Of course, he may have even been both. But we've gone off track a little, although I'll never say no to representing the rainbow community, even if it's speculative. So let's head back to Ballarat. Hopefully now, though, you've got a sense of the kind of man Thomas was. He was not the kind of soldier who wanted to go out in a blaze of glory, nor was he prone to sending his men into unwinnable expectations. He had all the sins of his time, sexism, racism, and certainly a sense of British exceptionalism, but he felt a soldier's job was to win fights, not give poets something to write about. He was prepared to take every advantage he could in a fight, no matter how unsporting it was, although this was something he carefully concealed from his political masters, as we'll hear shortly. The notion of sportsmanship and doing things the British way was a very important one in the 19th century and led to all sorts of unnecessary catastrophes as well, which we often later immortalised as shining examples of grit and British spirit. Thomas does not appear to have had any interest in being immortalised, nor of sacrificing his men for the same end, nor does he appear to have cared for listening to politicians who told him how to fight wars from behind their desks while he was on the ground. All these points had a significant impact on the way he fought at Eureka and for how he wrote his report in the aftermath. So now that we know who Thomas is, let's take a break. And when we get back, we're going to go straight into his report and have a look at what was said, what was not said, and what it all meant. I'll be back in a moment. And welcome back. This is The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis. Now, Captain Thomas's report begins with the usual platitudes of the era, and he declared that he had the honour to inform the Major General of the situation on the ground. This report, though, was not actually for the Major General, who was a very experienced soldier named Sir Robert Nicoll, but for the Governor of Victoria. But Thomas was not an important enough military officer yet to directly address his reports to His Excellency himself. They had to be passed to the Governor by the Major General, who was the senior military officer in the colony. This rather silly game of pass the parcel also took place because Thomas did not actually report to the Governor. The army had a small measure of independence in the colonies, and Thomas took his orders from the Major General, who in turn answered to the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in London, not the Governor of Victoria, although he was expected to seek the Governor's guidance before making any major military decisions. Nicoll had to approve Thomas's report before it went to the Governor, although whether he read it himself or simply rubber-stamped it will never be known. But we do know that he had been in near constant communication with Thomas for over a week. By the time Thomas sent this report through him, Sir Robert Nicoll was already well aware of the situation and had previously green-lighted Thomas to take whatever actions he deemed necessary. As we've also heard in previous episodes, Nicoll himself was already on his way to Ballarat with artillery and reinforcements when Thomas's men attacked the stockade. Thomas then goes on to talk about the actions of the Ballarat rebels, as he described them. As readers of my blog will know, I disagree with the characterisation of Eureka as a rebellion and its participants as rebels. Apart from a small number of mostly Irish radicals within the stockade, few stockaders wanted to overthrow British authority in Ballarat, let alone the whole colony. However, Thomas, as well educated as he was, probably didn't have the vocabulary to describe the stockaders any other way. They had taken up arms against the authorities, who represented Queen Victoria herself, and were therefore, in his mind, rebels. He uses this term frequently in his report, and it also permits him to distinguish between the stockaders, the active combatants, and the civilian population of Ballarat, who had found themselves caught up in the middle of an extremely violent affair. The actions Thomas describes are those we've touched on before and included drilling and looting by the stockaders, building the stockade itself, and generally acting in a warlike manner, which convinced Thomas and his men that they were in imminent danger of attack. Now, just 2 days before the battle itself and a day before the stockade was erected, on the 1st of December 1854, there was an event which Thomas took as certain proof the government camp would be attacked if he did not act quickly. Shots were fired at the sentries guarding the bridge, which led to the government camp enclave. Now, I want to look at the timeline here so that we can understand what this looked like to Thomas and to the unfortunate sentries who found themselves dodging bullets, because it's quite significant. This wasn't an event that occurred in isolation. The day before the sentries were fired on, reinforcements from the 12th Regiment of Foot had been attacked by a band of diggers after they lost their way trying to find government camp. Luckily, no one was killed, but several soldiers were seriously wounded, and the diggers looted the carts on which the soldiers' muskets were being carried. And those men who had managed to retrieve their guns before they were stolen started firing wildly into the night at an enemy they couldn't see. Now, there are no reports of diggers being killed or injured, although it's highly unlikely they all got away unscathed, given the wild nature of the firing. By the time the 40th Regiment managed to get down to the diggings to rescue their comrades, they came upon a very ugly scene. Some of the 12th Regiment had been beaten so badly they had to be carried up to government camp, while others had been chased or pushed down mine shafts. The lucky ones in these cases simply had to wait for ropes to be thrown down and for their comrades to help them climb back up. But others were too badly injured to help themselves, and other men had to climb down to get them. Several of the 12th had also been shot, none fatally, including their drummer John Egan, who was barely 15. While the diggers retreated when the 40th Regiment approached, they did not disappear entirely and followed them as they escorted their confused and frightened colleagues back to government camp. I will note here that not all of the diggers participated in this, and one civilian diarist who lived near the Eureka lead where the attack took place denounced it as cowardly. Quite a number of diggers also assisted to find the soldiers who had been chased away from the ranks and into the bush, or brought up those who were at the bottom of mine shafts. And at least one doctor on the goldfields presented himself at government camp and offered to help treat the wounded, although whether his offer was accepted is unknown. So then, the very next day, when some of his reinforcements were in hospital following a violent attack, Captain Thomas received reports that his sentries were being fired at from the goldfields. Also remember that throughout the day, Thomas had been watching stockader raiding parties going about stealing weapons. Now, we've already examined the stockaders' point of view, and we know they saw all these actions as defensive, but they couldn't have sent a clearer message that they were belligerent if they'd tried. It's almost as if they wanted to provoke a fight. Now, we know they didn't, or at the very least, they didn't on the 1st of December. They certainly wanted a fight, but they wanted it on their own ground and their own terms once they had enough men, guns, supplies, and better organisation. Now, of course, the big question is, did the soldiers who were shot at on the 1st of December, the sentries on the bridge, shoot back at the diggers? The answer is yes, they most certainly did. Peter Lawler was rather indignant about this and tried to argue in his letter that the soldiers were firing wildly into the tents and onto the diggings. But what the hell did he expect the soldiers to do? Honestly, if you're stupid enough to shoot at armed soldiers, especially those who have watched you attack their comrades the night before, I guarantee you they will shoot back. It's not clear if anyone was killed or injured on the diggings, and no harm came to the sentries, but it increased tensions and convinced Thomas more than anything that he needed to act quickly. Government camp could not be seriously defended against a determined assault. It was poorly planned, it was made of wood and canvas, it was small, conditions were cramped, there'd be no way to manoeuvre, and at the height of the stockaders' movement, Thomas and his men were outnumbered 25-1. Any attack by these men on government camp would have been incredibly bloody as well, because you can bet the soldiers were not just going to lay down their arms and surrender, and it was something Thomas wanted to avoid at all costs, although he and Captain Charles Paisley, who he had appointed as his second-in-command, did make contingency plans that would probably have slowed an attack in the event that such a thing occurred, but are very unlikely to have been able to stop it in its tracks. His report then moves on to his actions on the 2nd of December, as he watched the stockaders build their now famous barricade. Lawler mentions in his letter that he was certain there were government spies among the stockaders, and Thomas confirms that he was absolutely right. 2 plainclothes policemen, one disguised as a digger and the other as a storekeeper, were in the stockade and were bringing regular reports up to Commissioner Reed, and Reed was undoubtedly passing these reports on to Thomas. Now, undoubtedly, there were more than 2 spies among the stockaders, but Thomas doesn't mention any more by name, and sadly, they've been lost to history. However, there's a very interesting suggestion in Thomas's report that he may have had men in the stockade reporting directly to him, and there's also some evidence from Commissioner Reed's letters following the fall of the stockade that he felt Thomas and Paisley had had more information than he'd been given. This actually makes a lot of sense. While Reed was nominally in charge of government camp, Thomas was the senior military officer, and the soldiers in Ballarat were under his command, and the decision of if, when, and how to attack the stockade was his alone. He involved Reed very closely, but there's every reason to believe he would have been receiving his own reports, and that he did not share every detail of his plans with Reed, who was, after all, a civilian authority. Later on the 2nd of December, Thomas received a visit from Reed's deputy commissioner. Now, this was a man named Gilbert Amos. Now, unlike Reed, who was almost universally hated on the diggings at this point, Amos commanded a lot of respect among the ordinary diggers, and he was generally quite well liked. Now, he had a field office, I suppose we'd call it, down on the diggings. Like everything else in Ballarat, it was a tent. And he had been down there doing his work when he'd been abducted by a large party of Americans who had stolen his horse and gun and force-marched him to the stockade as a prisoner. Now, when they'd arrived, their captain, James McGill, who was mentioned last episode, had ordered Amos released as they didn't have any facilities for holding or guarding prisoners in the stockade. Now, if you think back to Peter Lawler's letter, he never mentioned this episode, although he absolutely knew about it. I think the reason Lawler didn't talk about it, and the reason that Thomas does in his own report, is because of what happened next. Now, had anyone in the stockade stopped for a moment to think about the stupidity of their decision to release Deputy Commissioner Amos after he got a look at their stockade in daylight, they probably would have gone riding after him and abducted him once more. Unsurprisingly, Amos went straight to government camp and reported what had happened to Thomas and Reed. And Amos had been a soldier himself in the past, so he was able to give Thomas a good sense of exactly what he would be facing if he attacked the stockade. Amos described it as a sturdy, well-built structure that would be difficult to break down and was too tall for a man on horseback to jump. He had seen the rifle sights built into the walls for the stockaders to fire from covered positions. He had watched the men in the barricade drilling with rifles, pikes and revolvers and had got a good sense of the layout of the position. Lawler said he believed Thomas and Reed got this kind of information from spies, but they probably actually got it from Amos. Transcripts of the trials in the aftermath of the stockade tell us that the spies gave more information about the attitude of the stockaders themselves rather than the layout or strength of the physical defences. I'm going to take another break here, and when I get back, we're going to look at what I feel is the weakest part of Thomas's report and why he wrote it. I'll see you in a minute. And welcome back to The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis. Now, following his mention of the capture and release of Deputy Commissioner Amos, Thomas notes that for the rest of the day on the 2nd, he was aware of the looting occurring on the goldfields and that the stockaders were forcing reluctant civilians to either join them or hand over goods without payment. I've talked about this before, but this was the moment where law and order had completely broken down on the goldfields. In hindsight, though, the question has been asked about why the soldiers and police didn't do anything. It was their job, after all, to protect civilians and maintain security in Ballarat, and there was understandable resentment among the civilian population that those charged with their safety appeared to be hunkering down in government camp doing nothing. This is a point of contention among Eureka historians, so it's worth pausing in our examination of Thomas's report to consider it. Why did the authorities, who were well armed and tasked with stopping this kind of behaviour, stand back while civilians were assaulted, robbed and pressed into service of a cause they did not wish to participate in? Technically, it was the police who should have stepped in. And I'd hazard a guess there were two main reasons why they hung back. The first was practical. They didn't have enough manpower to stop the violence, and had they tried, they likely would have found themselves outnumbered by armed stockaders and looters who would have liked nothing better than to blow them apart. The second reason for their inaction is less practical, unfortunately. The police were utterly incompetent and, to be honest, most weren't interested in upholding the law anyway. All but 2 of Victoria's original 50 police had resigned in the early days of the gold rush, and the then Governor Latrobe had been forced to raise wages by 50% to attract men to join the force. He also had to take on anyone who was prepared to put on a uniform, although background checks hadn't really been a thing anyway, which meant the potential for corruption was rife. And compounding this problem was that because the colony remained desperate for police until early 1855, officers were very rarely punished, even for serious crimes, and were frequently allowed to abuse their power. Most police in Ballarat were more interested in taking bribes and prosecuting those offences which resulted in fines, such as running a sly grog shop or being without a license, because they got 50% of the revenue generated from those fines. Few were interested in or had the ability to deal with serious threats to life and property. The day before the battle, which would go down in Victorian history, Ballarat was quite literally lawless, and those who couldn't defend themselves just had to hope for the best. And the army's role? If we lean on technicalities, they actually had no duty to step in and take action at this point. Martial law had not been declared, and the spree of assault and robbery was still a matter for civil authorities. But, having said this, the divide between martial and civilian authority was not as clear-cut then as it is now. When fighting in conflicts overseas, the British Army was a military force like any other, albeit relatively unique among European armies because of its all-volunteer makeup. But at home and within Britain's sprawling empire, soldiers were often used a bit like modern-day riot police. Unfortunately, they were often deployed in situations where they really weren't needed, which turned very bloody very quickly, such as the Peterloo Massacre in 1819 or the Chartist demonstrations of 1848. But once law and order broke down, people did expect soldiers to restore it. So why didn't they? Why wait another 12 hours or so before acting? Once again, I think there are two standout reasons. Like the police, the soldiers were outnumbered by the stockaders and looters, so any attempt to confront them on their own ground would almost certainly have ended badly. Secondly, the British Army at this time was a massed fighting force, and its men were not trained for small group combat operations. Regular infantrymen were very good hand-to-hand combatants with bayonets in a one-to-one fight, and most could have held their own in a brawl or a punch-up, but they would have been utterly ineffective deployed in little teams running around after looters. Officers like Thomas and Paisley would have been very aware of the limitations of their force in a situation like this, and it would have been foolish of them to attempt to deploy their men in a fight that they would almost certainly lose. This leads to the next part of Thomas's letter, in which he gives a strange explanation about why he didn't do anything while this anarchy was in full swing. And I'm going to quote here, it's just a sentence or so. "I did not consider it prudent to attack them, as they were not collected in any one spot, and the safety of the camp would have been risked had a larger portion of the force been withdrawn." The second part of this sentence makes sense. Thomas would have had to deploy most of his troops to try and round up the looters, and it would have left government camp vulnerable to attack. The army's primary role in Ballarat at this time was to defend government camp, after all, and the diggers had been showing signs for almost a week now that they would attack it once they had the organisation, as they and Thomas knew full well they already had the numbers. But what about the first part? We've touched on it briefly. In 1854, regular infantry were not trained to fight in small groups, but I think it goes deeper than that. Remember what I said at the beginning of the podcast about how Thomas was writing for an audience? I think this sentence was specifically written for Sir Charles Hotham. Hotham was an ex-military man, but he'd been a sailor, not a soldier, and was from a social class who believed everything should be done the British way, even if the aforementioned way was the most inefficient and stupid solution out there. Thomas was a step down from Hotham on the social ladder, and the army was well below the navy in the British military hierarchy. But Thomas's experiences had taught him that the British way had to be tempered with common sense and good strategy. The idea that Thomas had waited until there were sufficient numbers of stockaders to make the attack worthwhile and strike a blow for the empire would have appealed to Hotham and his legislative council. According to their way of thinking, this was the right way to do war. Rounding up a few ragtag rebels was beneath the British Army, and it was far better to wait and display its full might. It would also serve as a deterrent for any other groups thinking of trying something similar. If you think back to last episode, you might also recall that Peter Lawler was also rather scathing of Thomas's reasons for not attacking the stockaders on the 2nd of December, and claimed that any attempt by the military to attack the stockader raiding parties during the day would have been met with a massed attack. Lawler suggested that Thomas could have had the honour of crushing a much larger number of men than were present on Sunday morning. Now, this is a moot point because Thomas didn't order any attacks on the 2nd of December, but it shows the disconnect between ideological Lawler and practical Thomas. Thomas didn't care if his victory was glorious or not. He just had to decisively win. And to do that, he needed 2 conditions to be met. 1, it needed to be the kind of fight his soldiers were familiar with. That is, a massed attack against a clearly defined enemy who were all gathered together. And 2, he needed the odds to be in his favour. He knew the stockaders would go back to the stockade, whatever Lawler and others later claimed, which would give him his first condition. And Thomas would have also been aware, from both his own spies and his own observations, that a large majority of the stockaders would return to their own tents overnight, which would reduce the number of men inside the barricade. Something he also knew, although the stockaders didn't know he knew it, was that they were planning a meeting tomorrow at the Adelphi Theatre to elect a new executive. Given the increasingly violent rhetoric coming from the current leadership of the stockade, Thomas was very keen to move on the stockaders before this meeting, just in case the new executive had even more radical ideas. In colloquial terms, he needed to get them before they got him. This is mentioned in his report, in which he tells Sir Charles that he intended to attack the stockade at daylight the next morning. This is often held up as evidence by the pro-stockader crowd that the attack was illegal because Thomas pre-planned it without trying to de-escalate the situation or have the Riot Act read before attacking. However, the passage needs to be put into context. First of all, of course, an attack on the stockade was being planned. What did people think the military was there for? And whatever the stockaders later claimed, once they took up arms and built their defensive enclosure, they placed themselves outside the constitutional protections of the time, and the army, and by extension Captain Thomas, who was in charge of the aforementioned army, had the legal authority to act as they did. This was spelled out in the Reform Bill of 1831, which laid out how military and civilian authorities could legally deal with any situation of a riotous and tumultuous nature. This was the law in effect in Britain and the British Empire, of which Victoria was a part, in 1854, and actually required the military to put down any act of riot or insurrection. From a modern Australian perspective, of course, this is horrifying. The idea that the government of the day could just decide a meeting was illegal and send in the military to violently disperse it. But for its time, this was ordinary. The stockaders themselves would have known this. Also, let's just be clear, the stockaders had long moved past illegal meetings and riots and were speeding towards treason and insurrection by the time the military launched their attack in the early hours of Sunday morning. Any Western government at the time would have responded in the same way, and the laws around using the military to disperse riots and tumults were well known. What happened at Eureka was nasty, it was brutal, and it was hard fought, but it wasn't illegal. I'm going to take another break here, and then I'll go into the final few paragraphs of Thomas's report when I get back. Stick around. And this is The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis. The last few paragraphs of Thomas's report are fairly dry, but there's some important points in them that I want to touch on all the same. Once noting that he is going to attack the stockaders, he then goes on to detail the number of troops he had and who had been in command of each arm of the force before giving a very brief summary of the fight at the stockade. As we discussed when examining Lawler's letter, there is dispute about who fired first. I've actually got an episode on that question coming up very soon. And Thomas claims it was the stockaders. However, much like Lawler's claim that it was the soldiers, for the purpose of examining this report, it really doesn't matter. Even if Thomas's men did fire first, he wasn't going to put that in the report, especially not a report that was likely to be released to the public and would give Hotham a chance to scapegoat him if things turned ugly. It's also worth reiterating here what I said when we looked at Lawler's claim. Given both sides at Eureka were preparing for a fight, someone was going to fire at some point. No one had the high moral ground at the stockade, but everyone made choices in the lead up that could have been different. It was not inevitable, but nor was it the fault of only one side. In fact, I think the only thing Thomas's men had that the stockaders didn't was legal authority, at least while they were being fired on and until the stockade had been secured. He then mentions the behaviour of the police and troops in the aftermath and describes it as very good. As we know, it was far from very good, and the behaviour of police and soldiers in the aftermath of the stockade was criminal. So what on earth did Thomas mean by saying this? The first thing to remember is that Thomas was a career soldier who had seen things most people couldn't conjure up in their worst nightmares, and he was familiar with how Victoria's troops behaved towards their defeated enemies. Compared to some of the things that went on in Afghanistan and India in the 1840s, which Thomas had seen and probably participated in, the disgusting behaviour at the stockade was fairly mild indeed. It's also an uncomfortable truth that following a particularly hard-fought battle, which Eureka had been, it was believed at the time that men needed to be let off the leash for a while, as it were, and that this would help regular soldiers blow off steam and recover their nerves. The limits on their behaviour at the time were set by their officers and by the social standards around class, race and sex in the 19th century. At Eureka, where the majority of the stockaders were white and either British or Irish, the extremes of violence meted out in places like India to defeated troops were not acceptable, but violence did occur, including sexual violence against women, and the rampage was limited to the vicinity of the stockade and quickly brought back under control. This doesn't make it right, nor does it excuse any of the soldiers and police who participated in it, or Captain Thomas for allowing it. But it gives us a sense of why Thomas described the behaviour in the way he did. To him, this was normal, it was ordinary, and it didn't merit serious mention in his report. Undoubtedly, he also wanted to play it down for the public, but if public criticism was his only concern, I would expect to see more justification regarding his use of very good in this context. The fact that Thomas didn't suggests that even if he did not think the behaviour was very good, he didn't think it was too extreme either. The next few paragraphs are fairly typical of a military dispatch. Thomas mentioned those men whose assistance he's particularly grateful to, including Captain Paisley and Assistant Commissioner Amos, and conveys his deep regret at the serious wounds sustained by Captain Wise of the 40th and Lieutenant Paul of the 12th. The latter survived his injury and went on to have a shining career in the British Army, while the former would die a little over 2 weeks later, probably from an infection. He's still in Ballarat to this very day, actually, buried in the soldiers' enclosure in the Ballarat Old Cemetery, along with 3 of his men who also fell in the attack and 4 men from the 12th. 7 of the 8 men buried in that enclosure were victims of Eureka. Thomas wraps up his report with an estimate of the stockader dead, who he puts at around 30, and noted that several wounded stockaders were being treated in hotels nearby, including several who were mortally injured. Any unclaimed wounded, and there were some, were brought up to the hospital in government camp for treatment once the soldiers who needed medical attention had been seen to, and roughly 40 unidentified bodies, most likely Americans, were hastily buried in an unmarked grave in the cemetery. Thomas closes out with the standard sign-off for the day. I have an etc., with the and etc. most likely standing for I have the honour to remain your humble and or faithful servant. However, this wasn't quite the end of the report. Thomas included a list of military casualties which has since become Eureka gospel. He recorded 16 men either dead, mortally wounded, dangerously wounded, severely wounded, or slightly wounded, including 6 of the 7 who make up the group of men I'm examining in my thesis. This figure has been quoted time and time again without a lot of critical reflection, much like Lawler's list of the fallen stockaders. The assumption in popular history has always been that Captain Thomas would have known how many men he lost or were wounded, so this number has been accepted with very little question. The reality was quite different. With the exceptions of his officers, such as Captain Wise and Lieutenant Paul, Thomas probably didn't even know who any of the men killed or injured were. He would have been given a list of them by a regimental clerk who would have hastily compiled it based on who was accounted for or in hospital, and so mistakes were made. For example, the first soldier on the 40th Regiment's casualty list is Private Mahoney, killed, gunshot through head. There was no Private Mahoney in the 40th Regiment. The soldier in question was called Michael Ronnie. Interestingly, Ronnie may have been the first casualty of Eureka, but that's an argument for another day and time. I suspect that on the list Thomas was given of the dead and wounded, Ronnie had been referred to as M. Rooney, and Thomas may have misread this as Mahoney. Another error among the men listed as killed or wounded in the 40th Regiment is the absence of Private Dennis Bryan, who was, most likely, killed in action shortly after Ronnie was shot. He doesn't appear on this list at all, yet we know he died from a gunshot wound to the neck on the 3rd of December 1854 because it's listed in the muster roll. Also absent from the casualty list are any men who were lightly wounded, although we do have some who were slightly wounded. And in a fight like Eureka, it's impossible that some of the soldiers didn't get light wounds, cuts, bruises, strains, etc. Undoubtedly they did. Yet we know in modern militaries that combatants, be they soldiers, sailors, aviators or marines, are often reluctant to seek treatment for minor injuries, preferring to self-administer first aid. And there's no reason to believe that the soldiers of Eureka would have been any different in this regard. Given the number of much more serious injuries, those men with bumps or cuts probably didn't even bother to present at the hospital. So, in summary, what does Captain Thomas's report tell us about Eureka? Well, I think it gives us a perspective that is not often explored, that of the military who stormed the stockade. While the stockaders and the government get a lot of airtime regarding their individual arguments about what Eureka was, the military has not often been able to make its voice heard across the past 170 years. Historical military reports, like the one we've examined today, do not make for compelling reading. They're dry, they're full of chronological events and euphemisms for death and destruction, which make them unpleasant reading for a modern audience. However, they often provide an analysis of an event which is more removed from the politics of the day, not entirely, but mostly. British soldiers in the 19th century were not generally ideological, and even their officers were often less interested in the overarching idea of empire than they were in their own personal glory. Thomas, of course, was a notable exception to this rule, a quiet officer who worked hard and wanted to succeed rather than be big-noted. Eureka was typical of the kind of assaults he commanded throughout his career. It's probably one of the reasons he was able to retire quietly, highly decorated and well-respected, but without extraordinary public accolades, because despite the fact he tended to win, he wasn't interested in the politics of victory. As long as he could come out on top, preferably with as few casualties as possible, that was all that mattered to him. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis. New episodes are released every second Tuesday and available wherever you get your favourite shows. As always, if you want to get in touch with me, you can reach out on social media. I am Juliana Byers on both LinkedIn and Instagram, or find me online and check out my blog at www.skepticalhistory.com. That's skeptical with a K. And join me next episode for another skeptical take on the mystery that is history. And stick around after the credits if you want to hear the full text of Captain Thomas's report. Bye now. The Skeptical Historian is research produced and hosted by me, Juliana Byers. You can find a full list of resources used in my research by going to my rss.com podcast page and clicking on the relevant episode, opening the transcript and scrolling down to find the sources. That's rss.com/podcast/the-skeptical-historian. Sound effects are by Adobe Creative Cloud, Pixabay and Epidemic Sound, used under the appropriate license. The music track is The Whistle Funk by Telsonic. Podcast hosting is by rss.com. See you next time, skeptics. Captain Thomas's military report to Governor Sir Charles Hotham and Major General Sir Robert Nicoll. Sir, I have the honour to report for the information of the Major General the following details relative to a collision that took place this morning between the troops under my command and the Ballarat rebels. The Major General has already been made aware of the fact that a large number of ill-disposed persons have for some days been openly organising, drilling and equipping themselves with the undisguised object of attacking Her Majesty's troops and, if possible, subverting government. During the night of the first instant, Frequent signals were observed passing from tent to tent around the camp, and several shots were fired over the heads of the sentries. I therefore considered it necessary on the following day to issue a public notice that no light would be allowed in the neighbourhood after 8 o'clock, and that no discharge of firearms would be permitted on any pretence, and that persons disobeying these orders would be fired at. This notice produced the desired effect. Early on the 2nd instant, information reached me that the rebels were forming an entrenched camp at the Eureka diggings, about 1.5 miles from our camp, with the avowed intention of intercepting the forces under the Major General's command, en route from Melbourne. In the course of the afternoon, Mr. Commissioner Amos, in charge of the Eureka station, arrived here and reported that an armed party of the rebels had marched up to his camp, taken him prisoner and subsequently released him, but kept possession of his horse. During the whole of that day, strong parties of insurgents were parading the diggings in every direction, many of them in sight of the camp, robbing stores, collecting arms, and forcing people to join their ranks. I did not consider it prudent to attack them, as they had not collected in any one spot, and the safety of the camp would have been risked had a larger portion of the force been withdrawn. I determined, however, to attack the camp at daylight the next morning. For this purpose, the troops, detailed in the margin, were ordered to assemble at 2:30 a.m. At 3 o'clock, I left with this force, handing over charge of the camp to Captain Atkinson of the 12th Regiment, with the remainder of the troops and police. Just Juliana jumping in here, this next part of the letter gives us the numbers of soldiers and police who were involved. So Captain Thomas gives the force, either soldiers or police, the number of troops, their ranks, and who their commanding officers were. Her Majesty's forces, so that is police and soldiers, 30, all rank with Lieutenant Hall and Lieutenant Garden. Mounted Police, 70, all rank, Sub-Inspectors Furnell, Langley, Chomley, and Lieutenant Cossack. 12th Regiment, 65, all rank, Captain Quaid and Lieutenant Paul. 40th Regiment, 87, all rank, Captain Wise, Lieutenant Boulder, and Lieutenant Richards. Foot Police, 24, all rank, Sub-Inspector Carter. Total troops, mounted, 100, foot, 170. Accompanying us were Mr. Commissioner Amos, who acted as a guide, Messrs. Hackett, Police Magistrate, and Webster, Civil Commissionary, all magistrates. In excellent order and with perfect silence, the force arrived, in about half an hour, in front of the entrenchment, and about 300 yards from it, under the cover of a rise on the ground, the detachments of the 12th and 40th Regiments extended in skirmishing order, each having its proper support. Part of the mounted force of military and police moved towards the left of their position to threaten its flank and rear. The remainder of the mounted force of the foot police were kept in reserve. We then advanced quietly towards the entrenchments, where the revolutionary flag was flying. About 150 yards out, we were received by a rather sharp and well-directed fire from the rebels, without a word or challenge on their part. Then, and not till then, I ordered the bugle to sound the "commence firing." For about 10 minutes, a heavy fire was kept up by the troops advancing, which was replied to by the rebels. During this time, I brought the infantry supports and foot police up. The entrenchment was then carried, and I ordered the firing to cease. All persons found within the entrenchment were taken prisoners, and many of the fugitives were intercepted by the cavalry. I afterwards brought the infantry and a portion of the mounted police in charge of the prisoners and wounded to camp, directing the remainder of the cavalry to recover the government camp at the Eureka, which was about 500 yards from the place where we had stood, and which was reported to be in possession of the insurgents. Just Juliana jumping in here again. This is Commissioner Amos's field office. They found that it had been occupied by them during the night and that it had subsequently been deserted. The whole force accordingly returned to the camp. The number of prisoners brought in was 125. A few of them, however, I ordered be released, as I was not satisfied they had been in the engagement, although they were in the immediate neighbourhood. Several of them have been taken since on the charge of insurrection, which makes the number now in custody 114. The behaviour of the troops and police, both officers and men, in this skirmish was very good, and whilst I hope the Major General will be pleased to convey to His Excellency my appreciation of the conduct of the whole police force under my command, I feel it right to particularly notice the extreme steadiness of the foot police under Captain Carter, who were brought up with the supports to carry the entrenchment. I am most desirous of acknowledging the great assistance I have received in this affair and in all the arrangements connected with my command from Captain Paisley, Royal Engineers, who was good enough to act as my aide-de-camp on this occasion, and who joined the skirmishers in their advance. Mr. Webster remained under fire the whole time, giving me the benefit of his services. Mr. Hackett, the police magistrate, remained with the infantry, and Mr. Amos guided the cavalry to their position. I cannot omit from my dispatch the expression of my deep regret at the dangerous wound received by Captain Wise of the 40th Regiment, who, remaining at his post after getting a slight wound, fell on the inside of the entrenchment when conspicuously leading his company to the attack. Lieutenant Paul, 12th Regiment, also received a severe wound, but continued to do his duty in the ranks. The number of killed and wounded on the side of the insurgents was great, but I have no means of ascertaining it correctly. I have reason to believe, however, that there were not less than 30 killed on the spot, and I know that many have since died of their wounds. Amongst these and the persons in custody, several leaders of the insurrection appear, 2 of whom lie dangerously, if not mortally, wounded in hotels near the spot. The effect of this blow has been that the police now patrol in small bodies the length and breadth of the Ballarat goldfields without threats or insults. To such of the wounded as have not been removed, I have sent medical assistance, and have caused the unclaimed dead to be taken away and buried in the cemetery. I have, and etc., Captain John Wesley Thomas. P.S. Annex is a list of casualties copied from the surgeon's report. Ballarat, 3rd December, 1854. List of casualties incurred by the force under the command of Captain J.W. Thomas, 40th Regiment, in the attack on the rebel camp at Eureka on the 3rd of December, 1854. 12th Regiment. 1. Lieutenant W.H. Paul, severely wounded, gunshot wound to the hip. 2. Private William Webb, mortally wounded, gunshot wound in the arm and back. 3. Private Robert Adair, severely wounded, gunshot wound through the hand. 4. Private John Smith, severely wounded, gunshot wound to the thigh. 5. Private Felix Boyle, severely wounded, gunshot wound to the nose. 6. Private William Butwell, severely wounded, compound fracture of the arm. 7. Private Timothy Galvin, severely wounded, gunshot wound to the neck and ear. 8. Private William French, severely wounded, gunshot wound to the hip. 40th Regiment. 1. Private Mahoney. Correction, the man's name was Private Michael Ronnie. Killed, gunshot wound to the head. 2. Captain H.C. Wise, dangerously wounded, flesh wound on the right thigh, gunshot wound through head of fibra and fibrilla. 3. Private John Bryan, severely wounded, flesh wound in neck and leg. 4. Private Henry Coates, slightly wounded, gunshot wound in the side. 3. Private William Juniper, severely wounded, compound fracture of leg by gunshot. 4. Private Bernard O'Donnell, severely wounded, gunshot wound in the neck. 5. Private Joseph Wall, mortally wounded, since dead, pike wound in the lower part of the abdomen. 6. Private Patrick Sullivan, slightly wounded, gunshot wound in the arm.